Well, so welcome everyone. So we're starting a new series today on the influential religious personalities. Today we're starting with Dorothy Day. There's several personalities that we'll be looking at. We originally started with 6, and then we kind of realized, well, some of them, some of them we have a lot of material, some of them we don't have a lot of material. I thought I was going to do Dorothy Day and Mother Teresa today, but I realized, that, and I also realized I only had time to prep Dorothy Day. So, although the reason I wanted to do both was because there's a tie-in. As many of you know, Dorothy Day is in the process of canonization. And so the Catholic Church is going through that canonization process to become a saint, right? So Dorothy is to be a saint. It's a long process. And of course, Mother Teresa completed that process back in not too long ago, right? 2016, 17? Yeah, not too long ago. And she passed away, when did she pass away? She passed away 10? Was it 3 years ago? 4? Hers was quick because it was Mother Teresa. But I'll kind of talk about what actually entails to become canonized at the end.
It used to take centuries.
Right. It can be as quick as, they say that the fastest someone has become canonized was actually 5 years. So you may have been a little long. Anyhow, but for some saints, it's taken as long as like 700-800 years. And so the process varies. Anyhow, so that's why I was going to tie the two together. But we're going to just focus on Dorothy Day today, and then Dr. Bill is going to do another personality, another influential religious person next week, 2 of them. And then the following week, I'll do Bishop Tutu. And then the following week after that, I'll do C.S. Lewis. Now, C.S. Lewis, I have a lot of material on, so that I don't have to worry about running out of material there. And then Dr. Bill is going to conclude the 2 weeks after that, or with other characters. So anyhow, today we're going to start with Dorothy Day. So why don't we begin with a word of prayer. Oh, gracious God, we give you thanks as we come together and look upon these significant persons in our history, and many of them recent history. Lord, we give thanks to you for their lives and the influence that they had in the faith communities. And we look upon them, oh God, with not just admiration, but also as examples of what it means to live a life of faith. Lord, we pray for your Holy Spirit to be upon us, and during these next several weeks, as we look upon these significant individuals and their lives and their influence and the impact that they've had on our society as a way of understanding what it means to be a people of faith in this world. So be with us. May your Holy Spirit always be our guide. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, so Dorothy Day was born in November 8th, 1897 to November 29, 1980. So she was like, what is it, 82 years? 82? 83? 82? 83? Yeah, doing the math. It's hard to do the math when you span a century, right? Yeah. Something like that. All right. So Dorothy Day is probably most well known for being an activist. She's an activist, participated in many protests. She was an avid writer. In fact, that was her pretty much profession. She's a journalist, but also her work primarily in caring for the poor. She co-founded the Catholic Workers Movement, and like I said, she's currently in the process. It's like she's currently in the process. The Catholic Church is in the process. She's done all she could. The Catholic Church is in the process of looking into making her a saint. So, okay, so just a background story of her early beginnings. Her early beginning is actually what is very intriguing. I mean, sure, her work as, you know, her activism is interesting, but her early life is really interesting. So Dorothy Day was born in Brooklyn, New York, in a nominally religious middle-class home. And what does it mean to be nominally religious? It means that, yeah, they consider themselves Christian. You know, her parents were married in an Episcopalian church, and so they considered themselves Episcopalian, but didn't go to church. So you know, so that's what nominally religious means. Is that, you know, it's like we have a lot of folks like that today. In fact, you know, you take the census, and it's always amazing when the statistics come out and they say that, you know, what is it, like more than 50% of Americans consider themselves Christian, right? And something of like 80% are religious. And you look around, it's like, really? Right? Because they mark it as if they are part of a certain faith. And again, the Christian faith, you know, they mark that, but not necessarily participate in anything. They don't go to church. You know. So that's a huge part. And so back in the turn of the century, you know, her family were very nominally religious, middle class, didn't go to church. Although during her teenage years, what do you call, the pastor at her home church, or their church, whatever, neighborhood church, encouraged the mother to start bringing the kids, and her brothers began joining singing in the choir. I guess there was a boys' choir or something like that. And it says that she was very intrigued by the liturgy of the church, even though it didn't quite, she was just intrigued by it. She's been an avid reader, and some of the literature that she enjoyed most was Russian literature, which also kind of leans into her activist inclination. Many people would call her a socialist, you know, and she had very much a communist inclination in terms of societal change that was needed. She went to the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, Urbana-Champaign, to become a writer, a journalist. And, but she left the university after 2 years, moved back to New York to live her life. And the life that she lived was one of, you know, they described her life as being very bohemian, lived it up, you know, pretty much enjoyed life. Fill in the blanks of what that means. Enjoyed life. She was, you know, it was interesting. They say that, you know, in her college years, she wasn't really involved in any of the social scenes. She didn't really. She wasn't a party person like a college party person, but she was one that had a lot of relationships, put it that way. At the age of 20, so, you know, after 2 years of college, she went back to New York, and she fell in love with a man named Lionel Moisey. Huh? Yes. So. Lionel Moisey, I didn't realize. Okay, so there's some writings that say that Lionel Moisey was a writer, pretty well-known writer, and the one who taught Ernest Hemingway. So very very influential. Fell in love with this guy. Got pregnant, and was in a very unhappy relationship, put it that way. Lionel Moisey actually threatened her, saying if she does not get an abortion, he will leave her. Okay, so And again, at this time, she wasn't very religious. Again, she wasn't attending church or anything like that. And abortion was illegal at that time. So, but because of that tension in the relationship, she ended up getting a divorce. She ended up getting a divorce which greatly affected her. She fell into depression. She had a couple of suicide attempts. And Lina ended up leaving her anyway. So she goes through these really, her early life is one where, she's searching for something. Immediately after Lina leaves her, she gets married to Berkeley Toby, who was the editor, the managing editor of a publication, newspaper. So she goes back to New York and she works for different publication, whatever companies or newspapers and things like that. And so she was working for this company called Masses, I think, and just kind of marries the editor. She was young, she was attractive, and she later writes in a book that she wrote later, saying that this was a rebound marriage, right? And she told her mom, I'm just marrying him for the money. The marriage lasted not even a year, and she gets a divorce. So now she had an abortion, and a divorce. Well, the other one, she wasn't married. She just had a kid. So, okay, right, well, yeah, right. She didn't have, so she got pregnant, not married, got an abortion, got married, got a divorce. She's just checking it off, right? So, in that terms, she's not the, the homegrown, nice, next door neighbor. Yeah, she is, very much a young woman in the early. You're talking about early 20s, right? And so, so she has a very interesting, again, background. Like I said, the marriage doesn't last long, and. Yeah, right around what happened? 1918, 1920, yes. She was 1920-ish, something around there. And then, the marriage gets dissolved in 1921. And then in 1924, just a couple years after that, she publishes the book. It's a book called The 11th Virgin. And it's a semi-autobiography. Okay, so it's actually about her life, but she writes it in a third person. And it's about the life of a young woman living in the Lower East Side, New York. And in that book, she talks about the tragedies and the hardships and the struggles. And in that book, it talks about you can read her yearning, searching, and just the regrets in some of the events in her life. Hollywood ends up buying this book, or buying the rights of this book, and she gets $2,500, which is a lot of money back then, I guess, because she bought a house in Staten Island from the sale of this book. Okay, so good for her, I guess. So she buys a house in Staten Island, which she considered it as, this is her writing retreat home. Well, that's her home. And as she lives in New York, she meets another guy named Forrester Banningham, and gets involved with him. And he is an activist. They both have very much socialist, communist type of inclinations, and it's very active in that type of young, movements, protests, and so forth. She gets pregnant again, and for her, she was delighted that because she didn't think she could get pregnant after the abortion. after the abortion, back then, again, illegal abortion, so not quite sure about how that abortion was, but she didn't think that she would get pregnant again, so when she got pregnant, she was excited. She gave birth to her daughter, Tamar, in 1926, she gave birth to Tamar in 1926. And she felt, once she gave birth to her daughter, that the world that she'd been living, she was unhappy with. And of course, she's also very active in protesting against societal norms. And she felt that there has to be something that was a source of foundation for her daughter. And so she wanted to have a stable home. Unfortunately, Forrester, bohemian lifestyle, didn't want a child and didn't want to be tied down. As she's raising Tamar, she wanted to raise her in the faith. She met a Catholic sister, and this is where she starts getting interested in the Catholic Church, and was arranging for Tamar's baptism. Well, Forrester didn't want anything to do with baptism, or he was very anti-organized religion. He was also very anti-marriage. And so after one night of really bad fighting, Dorothy Day basically tells him to leave, and there goes that relationship. But this becomes the turning point for her. She clings to the faith as a way of putting her life back together. And again, she wants to raise Tamar in a different world than the world that she was protesting against, and the life that she had come to know. She wanted to provide that faith foundation. She realized that the world that she knew, living wildly and opposed to the many ways, was lacking a grounding that only religion could provide. And so then she actually, for a brief moment, she actually does move to Los Angeles. This is around 1928, 1929. Something really big happens around then.
Oh, the Depression.
We weren't around for that, right? Okay, I don't think so. But we've been in other depressions, but anyhow, no. So she moves back to Los Angeles to start a new life, to forget about Forrester and forget about all of that life. But the depression happens, and she ends up going back to New York because of the Great Depression, and starts working at a newspaper company a publication, a Catholic publication called Camarillo. In 1932. She goes to Washington, D.C., starts working for a Catholic publication. And so she goes to Washington, D.C. to write about an event that's happening in Washington, D.C. in 1932. It's a communist-inspired hunger march. And during that hunger march, this is what she's actually, reporting about all this, and she says this: I could write, I could protest to arouse the conscience, but where are the Catholic leadership in the gathering of bands of men and women together for the actual works of mercy that the comrades, interesting she used the word comrades, comrades had always made part of their technique in reaching the workers. So what happens is that she, as she's reporting about these movements that she was very passionate about, she questions, she could report and write about how everything is unjust and things like that, but she has this really big yearning, like, what's the point of just talking about it? Do something, right? And after she writes in her book later, her accounts of this, And right after, so after the march, she then goes to a church of the Nativity? No, the Church of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., goes there and offers a prayer. And she prays, and this is at the Catholic Church, she prays that she finds a way to use her gifts and her talents to help her fellow workers and the poor. Okay? She then flies back to, or she doesn't fly, I guess drives back. This is back in New York, right? She goes back to New York from Washington, D.C. How do you travel back then? Is it train? Horse and buggy? Yeah, this is during the Depression. So, yeah. They had cars and trains? This is a totally foreign world to me. But anyhow, she goes back to New York, and there waiting at her apartment was a guy. Another guy. But this guy would be a very significant guy, something like 22 years older. So not one that she's going to be romantically involved with. She meets a guy named Peter Marin, and instantly, okay, so Peter Marin was a guy, he was an immigrant from France, was also very passionate about social reform, and had been talking to various folks, and in a conversation with the editor of Camarillo, the company that Dorothy Day was working for, the editor tells him, yes, you got to meet Dorothy. And so then he, and then yes, she was on assignment in D.C., blah, blah, blah. So he waits for her until she returns. And as soon as she returns, he starts talking to her about her ideas. You would think that Dorothy Day would call the police, right? Someone's waiting at her door when she gets home. But no, she listens to everything that he says. And it's as she writes later on that she felt like he was like her soulmate, but not romantically, in terms of that passion for social justice. So and that was in 1932. A year later, and so they start having a lot of conversations, a lot of talks, sharing their ideas and things like that. Although their ideas weren't always the same. She was more of an activist that wanted to point out all the wrongs of the established structure. He was also very passionate about social reform, but more wanted to write about what they call easy essays, where he wants to talk about how everyone should be more charitable. If everyone is more charitable, then the world will be a better place. How we should just it's not as hard line than Dorothy Day, and yet something worked between the them. Anyhow, so they get together and they decide in 1933, May 1st, they begin publishing their own paper. It's called The Catholic Worker, and that's what she becomes known for, right? Now, this is 1933. What's happening in 1933? It's still in the middle of the Depression. There's no money, right? So there's no money, and but they want to get this word out. They're so passionate to get this word out. They print 2,500 copies. What money? They didn't have any money. They just ground whatever they. So they pretty much begged and asked for others to help support. So for print 2,500 copies, sell these papers for 1 cent each. I guess that's the going rate back then. I don't know what the going rate was, but they say that they didn't even know how often they would be able to publish. But they put this paper out, and And in this paper, the Catholic the worker publication, was an unapologetic advocacy for justice. And like I said, it's basically pointing out the problems with society. And again, in it were they combined the writings of Dorothy Day that was very critical, but also the writings of Peter Marin that were the easy essays. So in a way, it worked. Very critical, but here's some of the easy ways to kind of work towards a better society. And as I was listening to or reading about what the passion in the injustice of society, it kind of made me reflect on the other class that we're doing on the major prophets, because reading about Dorothy Day, I felt very much like she was a modern day prophet. What she wrote in these publications were the things that the prophets would speak out against the kings and the monarchy and the established society about the injustices to the poor. And much of her and Peter Marin's writing had to do with this passion for the poor. Here, just a little excerpt. Again, it was the Catholic Worker. It was a combination of writings from Dorothy Day that promoted radically and politically left ideas, along with Peter Marin's easy essays that did not trample on the class wars, but rather more about how charity needed to be exercised more and encouraging people to participate in acts of mercy. So, just kind of balancing it out. He talked about, teaching people to learn to live in a way that's productive, by the sweat of their brow instead of depending on others. And so they kind of, work together that way. Their writings, again, this publication started to grow rapidly from just putting it out there. They didn't know, if it would catch at all, but they started sending it out to priests and parishes, and they started to get more and more requests and acceptance. At one point, it was the publication, they put out something like 300,000 copies per issue, and they started publishing once a month. That was at the high points, but it wasn't always that way, because a lot of times what they wrote were controversial, or it did get on the nerves of some of the people in hierarchy, especially during times, later on during the wars, because Dorothy Day was an extreme pacifist. As much as she was a social activist, she practiced extreme pacifism and opposed the war. So opposed the World War II as well as all the other wars after that. And there was even a time when her views on pacifism was such a controversy that the church hierarchy asked her to remove the name Catholic from the title of the paper, saying that this is not the Catholic view. Because the Catholic Church, had their own stance. And for the most part, the Catholic Church, believes in just war, right? Meaning there are times when war is necessary. And so the cardinals or archbishops would ask her to remove it, but she would not. And for her, she always equated being Catholic with being a worker of justice. That what it meant to be Catholic, what it meant to be a person of faith, meant that you were a worker of justice and you always sought peace. She even had a file, or the FBI had a file on Dorothy Day. And someone that was that active, I think everyone has a file. But one agent said, what kept her file from getting even bigger was the fact that in the actuality, the Catholic officials truly believed her to be an honest and sincere Catholic. That she was truly acting out of her faith and that she wasn't some crazy person. And again, much of her views and much of her social activism was based on socialist and communist ideas, which also put her on the radar of the FBI and the authorities, I guess. But again, the Catholic Church would always back her up as being, she's truly. And for Dorothy Day, it was interesting. One of her commentators said, these were Dorothy Day's priorities in life. And the reason why, again, the Catholic authorities or the officials truly believed that she was acting out in her faith was that, first and foremost, the first thing that was listed, Dorothy Day, was that she kept daily communion. So from her, again, she had a radical shift because of her early life, and her relationships and wanting to raise her daughter. She really gravitated to the church. She went to daily mass, prayed her rosaries every day. That was part of her number one thing. Yes, she had radical journalism, okay, and it wasn't limited to just the teachings that the Catholic Church approved. It was radical in the fact that she truly promoted what she felt was justice. And the things that I listed, had a revolution of a heart, solidarity, love, service was things that she truly promoted, and she had an incredible passion for the poor. And when there's stories about her caring for the poor. I'll get to that in a minute. And that she believed that it was essential that in order to truly serve the poor, that you should voluntarily limit yourself or voluntarily be poor in order to connect with the poor. And she would write about the teachings of Christ in this, whether it be the Sermon on the Mount or in Matthew 25 about we're called to if someone is hungry, you give them something to eat. If someone's thirsty, and to do that, you had to be at their level. So, again, these are the priorities that they said. And of course, she also believed in racial equality, integration, pacifism, okay, contrary to the church teachings. In addition to these, in addition to her writings, she and Peter Marin opened up, starting early on in 1934, what is known as these hospitality houses. Have you guys ever heard of these? So in 1934, Peter Marin and Dorothy Day, again, they had just started publishing their Catholic Worker the year before, in 1933. They didn't know they would be able to survive, but it just grew really fast. So they were able to invest and not invest, but just be very frugal and utilize that. The following year, in 1934, they rented a 4-bedroom building. Not this one, this is modern day. But in 1934, they rented a four-story building, 11-bedroom, to be the first hospitality house where they served the poor. Basically, she and Peter Marin was so passionate about not just writing about it, but actually doing something about it. So they rented a 11-bedroom house. That's a mansion. And basically converted it where they housed people, the poor, the ones that nobody would take care of. In fact, there's stories of, in one incident, one of the workers, Catholic workers, or activists that was helping out, complained that one of the guests was being very racist and anti-Semitic, and that we should just, that guest is too much to handle and should be removed. And her response was, No, because he is, after all, Christ. Even one who was racist, she was even able to bridge that and say, even someone like that is Christ. Now we would think, what? To be Christ would be to be loving. Sure, they can be poor. Sure, they can be, ill. But someone that is racist, we wouldn't say like, oh no, that's anti-Christ, right? But no, she said that no, even someone like that was Christ, and that person continued to live in that house until the day, took care of him to die until he died. Within a few years, the number of hospitality houses grew throughout the nation to from Buffalo all the way to Seattle. They continued their publications, their labor, writing about labor rights, racial integration, radical equality. Dorothy Day later writes a memoir called The Long Loneliness. And in that, she writes this: we cannot love God unless we love each other. And to love, we must know each other. We know him in the breaking of bread, and we know each other in the breaking of bread. We are not alone anymore. Again, her whole context is that if we truly love God or to know God, then if we say that we love God, then we truly have to live out what it means to love by loving each other. And the only way to love each other is to actually be in solidarity with each person. And so, again, the breaking of bread is not just a ritual or a sacrament in the church, but it is truly the breaking bread with everyone. And so in the hospitality houses, it's not just a soup kitchen where people come and they serve the food. It's actually where she built communities of the people who had nowhere to go and the ones who were truly rejected. And again, kind of tying into the prophets, like yesterday, we're talking about Jeremiah says the same thing. He says that to know God is to live a life of justice, and to live a life of justice is to care for the poor, the alien, the widows, and the orphan. And in Jeremiah, he talks about that his call for the nation of Judah or the nation of Israel and the kings to truly know God, and the promise is that God will create a new covenant in us, and the covenant is that God will write the law in our hearts. And to do that is to truly know God, and because for Jeremiah, knowing God is synonymous with living a life of justice. If you don't know God, people who do not live justly or go around caring for especially the poor, do so because they have no concept of God. That's what Jeremiah gets to. So Dorothy Day kind of has that same concept that, the reason why she does all this is because it's out of her faith in her understanding of what it means to be a person of faith, to be Christian. One other thing here, emphasis. Her emphasis on social change. She writes, whatever I had read as a child about the saints had thrilled me. I could see the nobility of giving one's life for the sick, the maimed, the leper. Priests and sisters the world over could be working for the littlest ones of Christ, and my heart stirred at their work. But there was yet another question in my mind. Why was so much done in remedying the evil instead of avoiding it in the first place? Where were the saints in trying to change the social order, not just to minister to the slaves, but to do away with slavery in the first place? She gets to a very good point a lot of times, our churches, the churches that I served in, they say that, okay, so for example, Methodist churches. Being Methodist, there's two things that, Wesley really highlighted, is that to live a life of faith was, we practice a life of piety, meaning our own spiritual discipline, but it wasn't just a life of piety, but it was also combined with acts of mercy. So Methodists are always known for social justice work, or working with our hands as well as worshiping God with our hearts. Well, one of the jokes that we say in the conferences, Methodists are really good we're known for two things in a lot of our communities: soup kitchens and preschools. Now, preschools tend to be kind of going down lately, but still. But again, we offer this, right? Methodists are always known for having soup kitchens or some feeding ministry, and that's great and all. But the criticism to some of our ministries is that it's all charity, where it's easy to feed someone, give someone, write a check, support something, and help, but the flip side of that is works of charity is only one part of acts of mercy. Charitable work, yes, that's to feed someone right now when they're hungry right now. But to really care for someone who is hungry, you have to figure out how we can help them or teach them so they're not hungry, always hungry, right? There's that cliche, right? You give a person a fish, and they eat for what? They eat for a day. But if you teach them to fish, they eat for a lifetime, right? So the whole idea is that there's charitable work, but then it always needs to be accompanied by advocacy work. And that's what Dorothy Day is actually saying. And so what she was doing was both. She had these hospitality houses where she was caring for the people, at the same time these publications that were getting on the nerves of the society, the hierarchy, from politicians to the church hierarchy, about the change that needed to happen. So again, by her later life, her perseverance and work was finally acknowledged. She started getting acknowledgement starting from the 70s. They started to recognize her as, okay, she's a good person doing a lot of good. In 1980, after a lifelong work in writing and living in community and serving the poor, she died after suffering a heart attack. And right now, I think they said that there's over 150 Catholic communities, Catholic worker communities. So those hospitality houses or communities throughout our nation. And then, in 1980, she passed away, and she's buried in a cemetery near that home that she bought for $2,500 in Staten Island. It's like, how much is that worth now, right? So 18 years after her death, folks from the Catholic workers approached the Archbishop of New York, Cardinal John O'Connor, back then, and to discuss the possibility of canonization. So in 1998, they requested the possibility of canonization. A couple years after that, the Cardinal opened up officially the process. That was in 2000. Okay, 23 years later, it's still in the process. It's a super long process. So I was interested, what's involved in this process, right? Well, okay, so this is how it works. This is like crazy. Once the process is open, then the Vatican, basically the sponsoring community, the church or whatever, the archbishop, or not, yeah, of a regional, of the diocese, has to send to Vatican all the materials about that person. And the Vatican does a thorough review of the person, making sure, that this person lived a truly virtuous life. Okay, and they call it his heroic virtue. Okay, a very virtuous life. Once the Vatican validates, and the Vatican, the whole bunch of cardinals, says that yes, this person lived a virtuous life, then the Pope accepts that and declares the person venerable. Not a saint yet, just venerable. And then, part 2, there has to be 2 miracles validated, verifiable and validated for a person to be considered a saint. The first miracle then gets, after the first miracle is validated, then the Pope beatifies. It comes from the word beatitudes, right? Beatifies the candidate, giving them the title of blessed. And then after the second one, then they can be canonized. Now, so I asked the question, okay, so what kind of miracle? Yeah. What does it take to validate a miracle? Well, Mother Teresa, right? The 2 miracles that were attributed to her was that, and I forgot what year this is, but I think the first one was while she was still alive, but the second one was after she died. The first miracle was that there was a woman who had a stomach cancer, stomach tumor, and she touched a medallion that belonged to Mother Teresa or something like that. It's almost like touching the cloak of Jesus. And immediately, overnight, she was cured. And this was medically validated. Not just a story, so it had to be medically validated. Like, how do you do that, right? Is it Calcutta medicine? Okay. The second miracle was not in Calcutta. It was somewhere, I think South America somewhere, where there was a man with a brain tumor. Okay, so I guess Mother Teresa does well with cancer. Had a brain tumor, and after touching something and praying to Mother Teresa, something about this man, he woke up from a coma or something like that, and the cancer was gone. And again, all the medical exams and stuff like that, it was just done. So again, it had to be validated. So it's like, okay, so these are a lot of times healing miracles, but it has to be validated. And then the Vatican has to say, yes, it's provable, it is recorded, it is verifiable, boom, boom, boom. And then that's when you can have the 2 miracles attributed. The problem with Dorothy Day, okay, so we don't have those miracle healings yet, verified. But the controversy with Dorothy Day is actually not the miracles. It's her pre-life. Right. It's because of the abortion and her divorce. And it was pre-conversion. So that's where the controversy currently lies with Dorothy Day's canonization. But, a lot of the proponents of her canonization said is basically testifying her life itself is a miracle. The fact that here you have a person, nominally religious, lives it up, and in a way that, again, for a young woman back in the early 1920s to live that way, that's like, even that in itself is bizarre, because young women in 1918, 1920, you're fairly conservative. So she was like completely on the opposite end of anyone who would say that she was a person of virtue. And all of a sudden you have this complete turnaround, and she devotes the rest of her life. Well, she goes through 3 traumatic relationships, and that because of those traumatic relationships, her life gets completely turned around, and she devotes her entire life serving the poorest to the poorest. And in terms of humility, there's another story about her. It was one of there was some sort of a scholar or a professor or something from Harvard that was writing up, doing a research on her, the stuff that she does and stuff like that. Someone that's very prominent, someone from Harvard, went and visited Dorothy Day at one of the hospitality houses, and he introduced himself, and someone, one of the workers kind of pointed, yeah, she's sitting at that table with a couple of the guests. They would call them guests, homeless folks that were, there. She was sitting around and talking to them, so forth. So he goes over to them, and Dorothy Day, instead of saying, telling the guest, saying, oh, excuse me, I need to go and talk with this Harvard guy, she turns to him and says, oh, are you looking for one of, are you looking to speak to one of us? The way she responded was not in terms of, I'm better than, or, oh, I must be the important person. Her response was in such a way that the guests, were people, and the way she kind of treated them were like, yeah, they could be the ones that this scholar came to interview, not me. And so it's there's all these wonderful stories about her. Anyhow, that's all I found out. There's a lot more, but I ran out of time.
You mentioned in the beginning that she particularly liked Russian stories. Did they speak Russian, or did she read it?
No.
It was just translated.
Translated like Tolstoy and things like that. The reason why that was noted was because of her activist movement. A lot of it was based on socialist and communist ideas of social change, which again, back in the day, the communist idea was rising at that time, but then later on it becomes a very critical thing, right? Especially after World War II, then it becomes a real big thing. And so she's been labeled, several places as critique as being a traitor, or just again FBI file, right? But it was all big, and again, this is before her conversion to the faith, Catholicism. She just had this natural inclination about equality. There had to be equality. She was very staunchly opposed to capitalism, where the rich gets rich and the poor are poor. And so the whole her writings and her, these houses, these communities that she established, was to break down that sense of upper and lower and just create an equal community.
Was those houses the forerunner of Catholic Charities?
Do you know? Yeah, the Catholic Charity, I don't know. It was huge. But I don't know if Catholic Charity, I don't think there's that connection. No.
And then my other question was, through all of this, to get the money, where did she get the money for the printing?
Right. So,
because she didn't have any.
And again, she and Peter Marin, all the writings about them talk about how, yes, in those early days, they borrowed, they scrounged, and they gave IOUs, but they said that they never defaulted, but they had people to help them and kind of the cause, and the more, not the Catholic Church, not in the beginning, but later on, yes. Yeah. Actually, I don't think they ever took money from the Catholic Church. Yeah, I don't think they ever did. They talk.
It's not like today. We have computers. We have all kinds of things you can print on. You have to find a place to print.
Yes. Again, you're talking back in the 1930s when they started this. So again, incredible people that made a huge impact.
News of the daughter.
Oh, the daughter. So Tamar, she married a guy named Hennessy because she passed away in 2018, I think. So not too long ago. And she was born in 1926. Yeah. And so, she would have been 1926. She died in 2018. How old was she? Yeah, okay. She lived a long life. But she died with the last name of Hennessy. And what did I read? There were some accounts but in terms of was she active in the mother's work? Not necessarily like active, but there were a lot of interviews about her mom, and she talks about her mom. Yeah.
Are there hospitality houses around now, and are there any in this area?
Any in this area? I don't know. I can Google. Yep. All right. Thank you. Oh.
I don't think the church would have trouble because St. Augustine had an illegitimate son.
Yes, that's right. So that's right. Exactly. In fact, one of the articles talks about that. One of the commentators talked about as they were talking about Dorothy Day. They compared her to Augustine. One of the scholars said, her life was very Augustinian. Augustine lived a very promiscuous life. In fact, and I talked about this, right? His theology of original sin is based upon that he had a very promiscuous life, and that's why everything has that sexual connotation. He struggled all throughout his life with his sexual inclinations. And so, and I think he's a saint, right? St. Augustine. So I guess there's hope. It might just take a few more years. They have to then find these miracles now. I'm sure when they start talking to a lot of the folks that went through the hospitality house, lived there, I'm sure they would tell stories of their life miracles. Yeah. So, well, thank you for joining us today. It's the start of just kind of wonderful, fascinating folks who live their lives, live their faith in their lives.